whose job is it to judge? Now, of course, the simple answer is it's God's job. But it's also our job. But we have to make proper distinctions. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, when you're talking about judgment, this is the verse that is probably the best known text of Scripture used ad nauseum by non-Christians who want to justify their sinful lifestyles. It reads, of course, "Judge not, that you be not judged." Now, this text, contrary to popular opinion, does not mean we cannot judge at all. Jesus is emphasizing that we ought not to judge unjustly. See, we tend to be harder on others than we are on ourselves, and that's a definite no-no. But this does not mean we're not to judge at all. In fact, in this very text, if you keep reading, Jesus teaches that we ought to judge, but we ought to judge justly. Let me go to verse 2 and read forward. "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you seek the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Close quote. Thus, notice, we are to judge, but we must be careful not to be hypocrites when we do so. This makes even more sense when we see that elsewhere Jesus commands us to make judgments about one another's actions. For example, look at Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17. Jesus said, quote, "If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother." Obviously, in order to confront someone who has sinned against us, we have to make a judgment concerning his actions. Well, folks, in John 17, verse 24, Jesus commands us in the plainest of terms, and this should put the matter to rest. He says, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Close quote. That's again John 7, verse 24. See, Jesus does not say not to judge at all, but we have to judge with right judgment. Now, St. Paul adds something else to the mix that's very important when it comes to the proper manner in which we should judge. He commands us to judge one another in what he calls, quote, "matters that pertain to this life," close quote. In 1 Corinthians 6, verses 1 through 3, St. Paul says, "When one of you has a grievance against a brother, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more matters pertaining to this life?" Catholics, we must recall that we will be judged not only in accordance with the corporal works of mercy, as Jesus makes very clear in his famous teaching on the Last Judgment in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46, but we'll also be judged in accordance with the spiritual works of mercy. Now, let's do a quick review here. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 2447 lists the corporal and spiritual works of mercy as, of course, the corporal works: feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and imprisoned, and burying the dead. But the spiritual works of mercy are not quite as well known, which include forgive those who ask pardon, forbearance against wrongs committed, comforting those who suffer, consoling those who have suffered loss, and admonishing the sinner or advising the sinner, and instructing the ignorant. Now, folks, in order to admonish the sinner and to instruct the ignorant, we must make judgments. In fact, Ezekiel chapter 3, verses 18 and 19 tells us that if we do not admonish the sinner when we are obliged to do so, there are very serious ramifications for us. And I quote, "If I say to the wicked, 'You shall surely die,' and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way in order to save his life, that wicked man shall die in his sin, but his blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the wicked, and he does not turn from his wickedness or from his wicked way, he will die in his sin, but you will have saved your life." In fact, in the New Testament, James chapter 5 verses 19 and 20 refers specifically to the fifth and possibly the sixth spiritual work of mercy as well, when he writes, quote, "My brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins," close quote. Now this certainly fulfills the admonishing the sinner work of mercy and possibly instructing the ignorant as well. So what is the key here concerning our judging others? Perhaps the most important biblical text with regard to this topic is found in 1 Corinthians 4 verses 3 through 5. St. Paul says, and I quote, "But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. I do not even judge myself. I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then every man will receive his commendation from God," close quote. The bottom line is, folks, we can't judge the heart or the motives of others. This is the prerogative of God alone. We judge in the external form. God alone judges men with regard to their eternal reward. That is what St. Paul is talking about. Now, understanding this point and this text properly will help us to clear up the false doctrine of eternal security, or the once saved, always saved doctrine as well. Think about it. We cannot judge our own selves to be worthy of heaven, strictly speaking, according to St. Paul. We can and should have hope, to be sure. In fact, Romans chapter 8 verse 24 tells us that hope now saves us, as Pope Benedict so eloquently wrote about in his second encyclical letter, Spe Salvi. In fact, the title itself is a reference to Romans 8:24. We have this hope that saves us in that it helps us to persevere in faith. But hope by definition means we do not possess yet that which we hope for. As Romans 8:24 and 25 say, notice, "For in this hope we were saved." Hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience, close quote. Now, when this text refers to that which we see, it's using the word see in the sense of that which we possess. We do not hope for that which we possess because we have it. Why would we need to hope for it? Well, our final salvation then is something that we hope for. We don't possess it yet in full. It follows there is a sense in which we can say our salvation has not been fully realized. The scripture is clear that baptism now saves us, as 1 Peter 3:21 says. And Ephesians chapter 2 verse 8 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith." But scripture is also clear that there is the final judgment that is yet to come, as St. Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 4 verses 3 through 5, and as Jesus reminds us in his depiction of the final judgment in Matthew 25 verses 31 through 46.